Hello, and welcome to another episode of MMT Mondays. I am Enzo Codella, and I will be your host this week. Today we'll be discussing Rohan Grey's interview with Status Quo, where he spoke about minting the coin. So why are we talking about this today? You may be aware that about 30 million unemployment claims have been filed since mid-March. And while some, let's call it tepid, measures by the federal government have been taken, including the freezing of some student loans and the freezing of evictions for some HUD housing, it's just nowhere near enough. And we're still paying our bills. We still have so many debts to pay, but we don't have the paychecks to pay them with. In light of this crisis, Representative Rashida Tlaib introduced a bill in Congress that would afford every single person in the United States $2,000 plus an extra $1,000 every month. She's planning to do this by using the powers of the Treasury and the Federal Reserve. But if all of this could have been done from the get-go, then why haven't we done it? What is the government waiting for? And this all harkens back to such a toxic mythology that has been engraved into the American psyche for the past 40 plus years. The idea that the government is weak, that the government is bankrupt, that it cannot help the people, the basic function that it is supposed to fulfill, and that instead we gotta rely on the captains of industry to bring about the prosperity that we have been promised. If our previous situation did not make it abundantly clear that that is not going to happen, then the pandemic must have surely demonstrated it by now. The truth is that our markets have failed us, and our government representatives are so drunk on neoliberal austerity that they refuse to step up and do the very, very basic job of helping us survive, let alone thrive, but just survive, all while this pandemic is ravaging through our way of life. This is absolutely maddening, and we cannot allow this to continue. Well, I probably shouldn't generalize because it seems very clear to me that at least the Republicans know what's up, and they're just running through the back exit with all the money for themselves and their buddies. But the Democrats, true ideologues that they are, just keep preaching this narrative. It is so bewildering to see Nancy Pelosi proudly bragging about how she's refusing to increase the debt, the public deficit, in passing programs that would actually help people. It is so wild to hear presidential candidate Joe Biden being asked if he would pass Medicare for all if it had already passed the entire legislature, Congress, and the Senate. The bill was sitting on his desk, and he would say no. He would veto it because he doesn't want to increase the public debt and the deficit. It makes me feel like I'm in the Twilight Zone, something absolutely wild, inconceivable to me. And that is what we're up against. We are up against a political establishment that is either abusing this narrative for their own sake or absolutely believes it. We gotta debunk this horrifyingly toxic and pervasive myth, because this is how they keep us powerless. They keep us powerless by refusing to give us our basic necessities. They keep us powerless by refusing to give us the basic money and goods and services that we need to survive. Instead, we are told that we gotta get back to work. We are told that we gotta keep working, keep producing, even though there is no consumption, there is no demand. But all we gotta do is go get back to work in the middle of a pandemic. They want us tired. They want us overworked. They want us too exhausted. to do anything, to demand what we deserve, to demand what we are entitled to, because darn right we are entitled to this. That was the whole point. The whole point is that in the freaking 21st century, we are not supposed to be suffering like this. So yes, darn right, we need these services. Darn right, we deserve them. And that is why this is so important. We need to stay educated. We need to stay on top of the game so that we can demand what is ours by right. We need to make sure that our politicians do right by us, because they're our employees. We are their bosses, not the other way around. And this is one step, a very necessary one. We gotta mint the freaking coin, and we gotta give people the power that is theirs to begin with. So, without further ado, let's head right into the interview. And I will see you back here on the other side.
Hey, it's Jordan. Delighted to be joined by Rohan Grey, an attorney and president of the Modern Money Network. You're coming from Australia, but you actually helped write a bill of Congressman Rashida Tlaib that, to me, sounds like the most sensible and immediate steps that could be taken. It's not actually called this, but people were calling it online, mint the effing coin bill. I talked about it a little bit on my live stream yesterday, but could you kind of describe what are the major key points of this bill that makes it different than, frankly, the crumbs being negotiated between Democrats and Republicans right now?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So the first thing is that this bill, I think, is still the most generous bill out there. It's a $2,000 for every person, including dependents. So if you're a family of four, you get $8,000 in the initial amount, and then it's $1,000 for every month thereafter. And this is designed to be for every person living in America. And by every person, we mean every person. That includes, I live in America right now, so it includes non-citizens like myself. It includes undocumented people. It includes people who aren't in the workforce, who haven't filed a tax number, who don't have a social security number. And we're trying to make sure it's universal by having, first of all, distribution through a system of prepaid debit cards through the U.S. Treasury's Bureau of Fiscal Service. So people who do have a mailing address on file with a government agency will have them mailed directly to them. But if they either don't have an address or they don't receive one for whatever reason, they can go to one of any number of distribution stations at post offices, banks, public schools, government agencies, and request a replacement, and they would get one, or they would request a new one if they haven't received one. And for people who are homeless or elderly or physically disabled or who are at risk in other ways, setting up an emergency corps of people to go out and actually deliver these directly to people in their communities, and in the process to do a wellness check on them and see how they're going and assess whether they need additional assistance on top of that. So that's the sort of novel distribution mechanism. And because a lot of people don't trust their banks, they don't trust the banking system, we tried to use a mechanism to provide people with the option to get their money out in cash the minute they get these cards. These debit cards don't require signing up to a permanent bank account, and we're open to sort of other ways of making sure this is as accessible to people who are currently unbanked or don't trust the regular financial system. The last element, which is the part that you mentioned with the kind of mint the coin, is that we have proposed financing this through at least an initial financing of two $1 trillion platinum coins using the legal authority of the Treasury under 31 USC section 5112K, which authorizes the Treasury Secretary to mint platinum-proof coins in whatever denomination the Treasury Secretary chooses. And so under this proposal, the mint would mint these coins, sell them to the Fed, which would credit the mint's account at face value. The mint would then sweep those funds into the regular Treasury account. and then the Treasury would have them available to spend like any other source of revenue. And the effect of doing this is that this is a money-financed fiscal program in the same way as Representative Waters' larger relief proposal, which includes cash relief but a number of other important measures as well, is a money-financed fiscal program, and there is no debt involved. That from an MMT point of view is not really an issue anyway, because government debt is a form of money, but the public doesn't understand that. And also, even with the debt ceiling suspended right now, there's still this sort of number on the side of the Fox News building and people talking about borrowing from our grandchildren. And so we're trying to just get all of those kinds of how you're going to pay for it concerns just immediately off the table so we can focus on what's important, which is providing direct relief to families and to do so through using the government's power of the purse. And the way that this is intended to be set up is that it's not relying on the Fed to sort of money finance this. It's the Treasury using its own money power, which goes back to the birth of the Republic. The Mint is the oldest monetary institution in the US government. And even after the Fed was created, the Mint still retained the power to mint money on its own terms. So this is sort of, rather than trying to further entangle the Fed and the Treasury and further entangle fiscal and monetary policy, this is using the Treasury's own money creation power to directly finance a money finance fiscal program.
And to break it down in English, that the power of the Treasury, you cited Section 31, blah, 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 blah. To the layman, if the Treasury has the power to mint trillions of dollars in coins for an emergency, why doesn't it have the power to mint the coins for universal health care, universal education? I wasn't for the bank bailout, but why couldn't they have just done that as opposed to this whole dog and pony show going to Congress for $750 billion? If the Treasury has this power you're talking about, and maybe you could explain what that power is a little more, why is it that we have all this conversation about we have to pass the money and how you're going to pay for it if it's within the statutory limits of the Treasury already?
Yeah, so that's really important. There's a really big distinction in government budgeting between appropriations and financing. And appropriations is what Congress chooses what to spend on, and financing is the mechanism by which Treasury ensures the money gets out the door to people. And what we've seen over the last 100 years is that the Congress has actually tightened its control over the purse strings to say to the executive branch, you have to spend this much and not a penny less and not a penny more. Once in prior eras, presidents would sometimes not actually spend a little bit that they were supposed to. For example, if money was appropriated for a war that ended or for a bridge that was finished being built, they would call that impoundment. Or alternatively, sometimes they would actually increase the amount that the government had spent beyond what was appropriated by Congress through things like signing contracts on behalf of the executive that would obligate the government to honor those contracts in the future. But Richard Nixon basically tried to use that power to cut funding to black communities and poor communities in the 1970s, and Congress really pushed back against that with the passing of a bill called the Impoundment Control Act in 1974 that said, when we tell you to spend, you have to only spend how much we say and no more and no less. Later, actually, Bill Clinton tried to do something similar with the line item veto. Some people may remember this in the 1990s, where he said, if Congress passes a spending bill, maybe I'll say yes to the bill, but I'll say I don't want these certain things. And that actually went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court struck that down and said, no, you actually have to either pass the whole bill or nothing. You can't sort of pick and choose on your own terms. So the history of the debt ceiling itself is an attempt to actually give more financing discretion to the Treasury. Before the debt ceiling, every individual bill came with its own financing set of rules. You have to issue these bonds for this canal, these bonds for this war. And what would happen is Treasury would have some funds left over here and not enough funds over here. So Congress eventually said, tell you what, we'll just give you an overall spending cap, and then you make sure you meet all of the different spending commitments we've given you. Mm-hmm. But once that came into existence, it became a political football. And so suddenly that spending cap became a second way to sort of relitigate the budget after the actual appropriations process. So they would agree what to spend on, and then they would try to hold the whole thing hostage on the financing question. Since 2016, the debt ceiling has been suspended indefinitely and is basically dead letter. So it isn't actually providing any meaningful financing cap today. It's currently suspended until July 31st, 2021. But it still sticks in people's minds as this sort of conceptual thing that causes confusion and makes us think we're borrowing from our grandchildren or from China, or we need the support of the bond markets. So the real answer is we don't need to use the coin, but we also don't ever need to issue bonds. The two are functionally the same way of financing things, in the sense that the end result is the private sector, somebody, gets to hold something that looks like money. Now, Stephanie Kelton, an MMT economist who's got a book coming out called The Deficit Myth, uses the metaphor of yellow money versus green money. So government debt is like yellow money, regular cash is like green money. Or you could use the example of a savings account versus a checking account. I might not be able to use my savings account to buy something at the store, but I can always transfer my money into the checking account and then spend it. Right. So if I've got money in treasury bonds, treasury debt, and I want to spend it at the store, I just have to sell my treasury bond and turn it into cash. And as long as someone will buy it, then it's as good as cash. It's basically just a savings account. So what we're trying to do with this coin is say, you know what, this is all convoluted and stupid. Let's just mint a coin and finance any fiscal spending this way. And if we want to issue bonds, the Fed can be responsible for that kind of thing. And the answer to your question, to go back to it, I just want to give some context, is yes, we can mint the coin for other things as well. This was a really powerful proposal to begin with, because it's giving cash to everybody. So everybody can see that the power of the purse, the power of the Treasury's money power, works for them and can support them. And then once that opens the door, we can talk about using it for other things. So
call me a cynical Susie, but if we can do this, and obviously the Treasury knows we could do this, obviously, high power senators know this exists. Ben Bernanke infamously and Alan Greenspan basically said, well, technically, Alan Greenspan told Paul Ryan, well, technically Social Security will never go insolvent because we could just print more money. If we can do this, but they choose not to, is it cynical of me to say they just don't want more money in the hands of workers and they want more money in the hands of corporations, which is the same paradigm going on right now? The Republicans are trying to make sure that all the corporations get the brunt of the bailout. Democrats are making sure we want to help the workers, but it has to be targeted, which is another way of means testing. It just seems like the overall racket here is to make sure the money is not in the hands of the consumer class.
Yeah, I'm consumer class, working class, the poor. You're absolutely right. And I think the reality is here, whenever it comes time to fund the military, nobody asks where the money comes from. Yeah. And when the time came to fund tax cuts to the rich, nobody asked where the money came from. The president of the Minneapolis Fed, Neil Kashkari, went on 60 Minutes yesterday and said the Fed has unlimited cash to support the banks. He literally used those words. So the real question is only how come when the Treasury needs to spend on welfare or for hiring people in a job guarantee program, that we suddenly can't afford that and we don't have any money, or for Medicare for all. And the answer usually is that they believe that it's different to support the financial sector and have a sort of trickle-down system where you allow banks to create their own money and the government supports that, or you allow corporations to go into debt and the government backs the corporate debt markets, which the Fed has just announced it's doing, versus giving cash directly to people. And the fact that the Treasury always has this power to issue coins, it's been there forever, and the fact that issuing treasury debt is basically another form of printing money, means that this isn't some new technical kind of fangled capacity that never was available beforehand. What we're trying to do with this coin is radically empower the public and the average person to understand this. Because, yeah, as you said, the politicians know this, the central bankers know this. I guarantee you most people in the financial sector know this. But what they're incredibly scared of is that the average person will realize that the only reason that there hasn't been enough money to fund bridges and hospitals and public schools is because nobody wanted to get the votes.
And specifically for the coronavirus funding, you already have these crazy people like Lloyd Blankfein saying, let's speed it up here. If you're feeling good, we should send people back to work, which probably, if that happens, will make this crisis go even longer, lead to even more deaths. Do you think the best way is immediately the bill proposes $2,000 right away in this debit card for the debit card to then be refunded, I believe, every month? Not refunded,
refilled.
Refilled every month with an additional $1,000, I believe. Other people have said, let's just pause the economy, cancel all mortgage payments, cancel all student loan payments, rent, you name it. Should we do both? What is the best way?
Well, I won't speak for Representative Tlaib's office because she's got her own opinions on all of that. But what I will say is that from my point of view, first of all, I think it's probably good if Lloyd Blankfein stays home. Maybe he should go to jail rather than even get to stay home. But I think there are sort of three different elements here. One is to arrest the decline in incomes, and that's what this bill is trying to do. It's emergency cash relief. It's trying to stop the bleeding, but it isn't the only kind of thing. We need to expand unemployment insurance to keep people at their existing job levels. We need to expand various other forms of benefits that are targeted. But this is an attempt to make sure that nobody falls through the cracks with at least some basic minimum level of cash support, particularly people like undocumented people and homeless people and people who might not otherwise be eligible for programs targeted at existing demographics within the welfare system or within unemployment. The other side of things, as you note, is once in addition to increasing the amount of cash that can go out, you want to the cash coming in, you want to reduce your outflows. So you want to look at moratoriums on student debt, on rent, on medical expenses, on all kinds of things, that car loans, credit card debt, those kinds of things for average people. And you want to provide some sort of cheap credit and grants in exchange for some sort of public direction and sort of transformation to public ownership for small all the way through to very big businesses, to the extent we think they have public value. And one of the easy ways to do some of that would be to nationalize payroll. Bernie Sanders has proposed using the Defense Production Act to basically commandeer certain industries that are relevant. But the other crucial part, which other MMT economists, including people like Pavlina Cherneva, have been really advocating hard, which I think is also incredibly crucial, is we need a vision for a production side of the economy. Because while there might be non-essential to shut down, we do need to continue providing food and medical supplies and providing care for people who are left home alone, for people who are dealing with the trauma right now, for dealing with emergency responders, those kinds of things. And more broadly, at the end of this crisis, we still have a planet that's on fire. We still have people that are sick with regular needs. And if you look at what happened with World War II, when we needed to mobilize, we transformed the economy in a short period of time. We had places that were producing little widgets for cars suddenly producing things for the war effort. We had whole industries that didn't exist come into existence within 6 or 12 months. So we need to immediately stop the bleeding on the financial inflows and outflows side of average people's lives. But we also need to start thinking about this moment as our World War II mobilization, not only for the Green New Deal in the long run, but for immediate emergency care networks, solidarity networks, to ensure that however long this crisis lasts, we are not going to face rioting in the streets, starvation, electricity shutting down, basic supply chain, breakdowns. And the way that we're seeing around the world is a lot of that stuff is coming to some degree or other. And we need to be extremely proactive at this point. And that means things like working out how to find people who are immunized and getting them back out, and training people in emergency corps in a way that is safe and not going to spread the disease, but actually help people, etc.
And how do you account for, do these debit cards, let's say this passed right now, do these debit cards get mailed to you? Do you have to go somewhere to pick it up? Because obviously we're trying to avoid mass congregation of peoples at banks and other places.
Yeah, so we propose, I think I mentioned earlier, we're proposing 3 different ways of doing things. One is to mail it to everybody that's got a mailing address. Another is to have distribution stations, and that is a risk, as you mentioned. But one of the things is that if we do enough of a work with mailing to everybody and with the emergency corps that will be pushing these out to at-risk populations in a sort of individualized outreach, think of something like the census. Mm-hmm. And if we use those 2 very aggressively, the number of people that will have to come in to those distribution centers will hopefully be quite low. And the other thing is, the more of those distribution centers we can set up, the smaller number we will come to them. Think about what happens with voting. The more voting booths you shut down, the more packed the ones that are still open are. So the idea here is to make it hopefully something where it could be as widely distributed as sort of every second street corner, where 10 or 15 people might need to go there at maximum, and then we can have some sort of way of keeping people distanced and things like that during that process. And you're right, it is a risk.
So lastly, with the climate crisis, which you touched on, there's going to come a point, I mean, obviously Republicans and even the most conservative Democrats, they suddenly are socialists when their ass is on the line. So when the climate crisis, I don't want to say when it comes, it's already here, but when you start seeing mass climate refugees, when it's just to the point where something has to be done right now, and even the biggest deniers see that, couldn't we just mint the coin for, let's say, the 16 trillion Bernie's? I mean, we could do it right now from what you're saying.
Yeah, and I said that in my explainer video about Representative Tlaib's proposal, is that this is could be used as a regular financing mechanism for all fiscal spending, and theoretically, or perhaps even as a best option, we would just reform the budget process so we wouldn't even have to use a gimmicky coin. But the idea is that we don't need these kinds of budget bond market processes that are sort of left over from an era when we were on a gold standard, and there really was a big difference between government debt and government money, which isn't the case today. So if we wanted to, for example, you could just replace the existing $20 trillion of national debt with $20 trillion of coins, and buy them off, and those bond investors would be upset because they wouldn't have a safe investment instrument that earns them interest. But there wouldn't be any more inflation, in the sense that they would be holding $20 trillion of assets one day, and then they'd be holding $20 trillion of assets the next day. In fact, perhaps if you did it right, there would be less interest being paid out, which would actually be less money coming into the economy. So one thing to think about that, for example, is right now a lot of people who pensions and savings and retirement is locked up in these large investment funds that rely on government bonds for interest income. So when interest rates go low, on one hand, it reduces the cost of the national debt. On the other hand, it actually means that savers get less money. So we might actually need to look at something like pension reform and nationalizing pensions, so that we can guarantee some reasonable level of yield on people's savings, while at the same time not turning that into a handout for the bond market class and wealthy financial investors and things like that. But yes, as far as it goes to basic fiscal spending, there's no reason why we couldn't use the coin to finance ongoing fiscal arrangements. And if we decide we want a government securities market, then the Federal Reserve could issue its own securities. But it would be extremely clear to the world that that had nothing to do with government borrowing to fund Medicare or the Green New Deal. That would be just the central bank doing something for the bond markets as a deliberate bond market targeted policy. And that would help the public understand the difference at a very fundamental level.
And lastly, obviously Republicans, we know, would never go for this. What would be your message to the pay-as-you-go crowd like Nancy Pelosi, who basically kind of plays along with this Republican, debt myth? I don't think they would go for this either. But what would be your message to the Democratic Party that could do this and could propose this in a bold way?
First of all, this isn't increasing the national debt, so there's no concern there. Second of all, this is no different in terms of inflationary impact to regular deficit spending, which currently both parties are talking about doing at an unlimited level. Third of all, this isn't undermining long-term independence of the Federal Reserve or monetary policy, because this isn't asking the Fed to monetize government debt. This isn't asking the Fed to run an overdraft for the Treasury. This is the Treasury using its own money power to finance this program, and the Fed is just buying the coin as an asset. So this preserves monetary fiscal separation. It isn't more inflationary. It doesn't add to the national debt. And this is at a moment right now where we need bold, universal policies to ensure we don't turn this already recession into the largest Great Depression of our generation.
Thank you very much, Rohan Grey. You are the president of the Modern Money Network and an attorney. We will stay in touch.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.
That was absolutely beautiful. Absolutely love that. If you got any thoughts, comments, impressions, the floor, or I guess in this case, the comment section is yours. We gotta keep talking about this. We gotta make this the center of the conversation. Beyond the whole, I have the freedom to keep infecting other people, or the whole, I gotta get back to work because reasons, capitalism. The center of the conversation has got to be reclaiming the power that is ours by right, and making sure that our government does its freaking job. Minting the coin is extremely necessary, but it is only one step, one among many, that we have got to take if we are really to have an empowered populace ever again. If we are going to stand a chance to sustain a basic, decent way of life for the people. Keep that in mind and spread the word if you can, because this is how we win. We win by learning. We win by staying educated. We win by reclaiming the tools that allow us to see through their BS. And once we can see through their BS, once we can call them out on their blatant lies, then we will be able to reclaim our power in our society, in our nation. And only then we can construct a government that actually serves us, the people, and not them and their corporate interests. We need this. We need this desperately. And that's why this has got to be the center of the conversation. That's all I got for today. So I hope you all stay well, stay safe, use your masks, and we'll see you back here next week. Take care, y'all.